An ancient cloth with a mysterious image of a crucified man.
Something extraordinary had happened here.
Some believe it's the most important religious artifact in the world.
Scientists can't tell us how it came to be.
It's religion and science living together on the same piece of cloth.
Now modern technology brings science and religion together.
Because until you have science, everything's a miracle.
To resurrect a living, moving 3D image of the man on the Shroud of Turin.
Is it possible that the shroud presents an opportunity to literally see the resurrected Christ?
Revealing for the first time
the shroud gave us a blueprint for what that face looks like.
the true face of the man many believe to be Jesus Christ.
Were there people who didn't want us to do this? Oh, yes.
Is it possible that this 14-foot-long linen cloth captured the greatest paranormal event of all time?
It's a mystery that mankind has been trying to decipher for almost 2,000 years. The true face of Jesus Christ.
There's a long tradition in Christian theology and Christian history of seeking the face of Christ, of wanting to know what he was like as a man, because the incarnation, God becoming man, is the great story of Christianity. We don't believe in an idea. We believe in a man.
The face of that man has been imagined and interpreted in countless ways for hundreds and hundreds of years. But no one has accurately visualized the real Jesus Christ, at least until now.
In the world, people recognize the face of Jesus, and the irony is, nobody actually knows what he looked like.
But that may be about to change. Computer graphics artist Ray Downing is on a mission to resurrect the face of Jesus Christ as a living, moving 3D image. It's a task he's been devoted to for years.
The people who experienced Jesus during his lifetime experienced a real physical man doing real physical things. And the way I choose to look for Jesus is as that physical man, because that is what he came to us as.
Downing has brought other historical figures back to life, including Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln was not an easy job, but we had a lot of help. There are 2 life masks cast during Lincoln's lifetime. In addition to that, there's 130 different photographs by 31 photographers of Abraham Lincoln. So everybody has a very good idea, and we did too, of what he looks like.
But attempting to reconstruct the face of Jesus is a much tougher challenge. A challenge that leads straight to the heart of one of history's most controversial and haunting mysteries. The starting point lies in a chapel in Italy with the world-famous burial cloth, the Shroud of Turin. Embedded in its fibers is what millions believe to be the authentic image of Jesus' corpse.
If you want to recreate the face of Jesus, and you want to get the actual face of Jesus, you have only one object, and that's the shroud. It's the only object that can actually purport to be the actual image of Jesus with any kind of credibility whatsoever.
The Shroud of Turin is a 14-foot-long linen cloth. It's 3.5 feet wide. It's made out of flax. It is made out of a very distinctive weave, which is called a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern weave.
Actually very similar to the pattern that you see on a pair of blue jeans. There's actual holes in the shroud. There are burn marks on it. There was a fire in 1532 that nearly destroyed the shroud.
It burned holes through the cloth, and actually those are more prominently visible on the shroud than the image itself. It bears an image on it, ventral, front and back, dorsal, of a human figure.
The image on the Shroud of Turin is certainly consistent with what we know was a Roman crucifixion.
That figure has been beaten, tortured, scourged, speared in the sides.
He is apparently crucified. He has an obvious wound through one of the wrists.
You can't see the other one because they're on top of each other like this. There are no thumbs visible, just 4 fingers on each hand.
And the exit wound is basically near the wrist, which is actually forensically perfect.
The left foot is planted firmly against the cloth with the image of the right heel, almost like one foot was placed on the other.
There is a wound in the side, which is, if you look at the biblical tradition, that is where Jesus was lanced on the cross. It would be in about that place.
Then there's blood flowing down from that wound.
The body itself is covered with scourge marks from a Roman flagrum, approximately 120 of them.
The back image shows remarkably very clear a pattern of bloodstains all over the top of the head, the back of the head, from the crown of thorns. When you're looking at the face, you can see that one of the eyes seems to be a little closed.
Both cheekbones swollen, one more than the other.
The nose may be a little crooked, although it's not broken.
There's a lot of blood around the face.
Blood on the forehead, blood in the beard, blood in the hair.
It's almost like an autopsy, but an autopsy of a man who suffered unbelievably.
It is a remarkable, remarkable image.
But as the starting point for a 3D portrait of Jesus, the image on the shroud is extremely difficult to work with. In fact, it can hardly be seen with the naked eye.
The image on the shroud is sometimes very hard to see. It just seems to be almost blurry. That if you're too close to it, you don't see the contrast with the surrounding area, so you don't see the image. Partly it's because it's so faint, but also because it doesn't have any distinct outline to it.
Well, one thing that impresses me, this is a fainter image than I imagined it was going to be.
It's going to be very difficult to extrapolate this all, to figure out where everything is.
Working on a computer is fantastic, but there's always this desire to get physical and to have a physical something to interact with when you're talking. And so we had the shroud printed out on fabric so that we would have something as close as we could get to the real shroud to point and talk and discuss around. And it became a focal point in the studio that we'd gather there and discuss the shroud.
Using the latest computer technology, Ray Downing seeks not only to clarify the image on the cloth, he wants to bring it to life. If he succeeds, the world will see for the very first time the man many believe to be Jesus Christ himself.
For me, the motivating factor here is that nobody's ever done it before. This is the most remarkable face in the planet. Yeah. And if we can get closer to what the man actually looked like, that's history.
But there's far more to this piece of linen than a picture of a crucified man. It's a coded blueprint for resurrecting his image. A gateway into the unknown, to search for what no one has seen for 2,000 years. The true face of Jesus Christ. Computer graphics artist Ray Downing and his team of 3D animators are on a monumental quest to resurrect the presumed image of Jesus Christ from one of history's most puzzling artifacts, the Shroud of Turin.
This not body image down here. I'm beginning to worry. I don't know if there's enough information here to actually extrapolate a face from this. Nobody has done a CG version of Jesus based on the Shroud of Turin, and I'm starting to see why.
It's certainly going to be tough.
One of the difficulties of the shroud image in general is that, first of all, it's a very, very subtle image. So subtle that to the naked eye, you got to get about 10 feet away from it before you can even really kind of discern what the specifics of it are.
You almost feel like you want to step back from it to see what's there.
Exactly. And what I see is a complete lack of information, that you can barely see where one thing ends and the other begins.
That's because there's something very strange about the ghostly pattern encoded in this cloth. The man's skin appears to be dark, while the shadows his limbs cast appear to be light, as if the image were a photographic negative.
One of the hardest properties of the shroud image to convey to people is the fact that the image on the cloth has its lights and darks reversed. They're inverse of what's normal.
This strange phenomenon intrigued observers for hundreds of years. Then, a century ago, an Italian photographer unraveled the shroud's surprising secret, quite by accident.
Secondo Pio was an amateur photographer who, in 1898, wanted to photograph the Shroud of Turin.
He asked for permission of the Turin authorities if he could photograph the shroud. This would be the first time that the shroud was ever photographed.
It was no simple undertaking that Secondo Pio had.
Secondo had never seen the shroud because it was so rarely exhibited. The last time it had been exhibited, he had been 10 years old.
He had to deal with the varying voltages of the very new electric power in the Royal Palace, 1898.
He put his piece of glass in that was coated with a photographic emulsion, took a picture, took it back to his darkroom,
and he has this negative plate submerged in the developer solution. And as he pulls the negative plate out of the developer solution, he sees for the first time an image that nobody else has ever seen.
He was astounded. The story goes that he was so astounded he almost dropped a piece of glass.
The image, for some reason, was so much more lifelike, so much more realistic, so much more clarity than what you see on the shroud itself.
Being the religious man that he said he was looking into the face of the Lord.
So his image, his photo negative of the image, is what spread around the world and really lit the fire of shroud devotion.
Religious believers and scientists alike were suddenly caught up in the mystery.
How is it possible that the shroud image is a negative image on the cloth because what appears in a photo negative is actually a positive image? How is that possible? And so this then begins the scientific era.
The shroud's exact age remains uncertain, but it's known to date back to at least the 1300s. This means that if the shroud is a forgery, as many contend, then the forger created a complex photo-negative image at least 500 years before the invention of photography.
There's absolutely no way that a painter could have painted a true grayscale negative image while painting a face. It's sort of like writing your signature upside down with your opposite hand. Now, maybe there's some method out there that no one has ever realized yet, which is implausible, but it's possible.
Being able to see the shroud's face clearly is a huge step forward for the 3D animation team. But even the most advanced computer technology can run into serious problems when confronted with an ancient piece of fabric.
This is a piece of linen. So things like precise measurements of how tall the man might be are at best guesses, because the size of the Shroud of Turin can change by several centimeters just based on the relative humidity in which it's stored. So to be precise about these things is difficult.
Wow, this is really cool.
Aware of the obstacles that lie ahead, Downing turns for advice to the Turin Shroud Center in Colorado Springs. It's led by Dr. John Jackson, a man who spent more time studying the shroud than almost anyone else. In 1978, Jackson led a team of American researchers to Turin on an extraordinary mission to analyze this baffling cloth.
John Jackson was a key person in the scientific investigation into the Shroud of Turin. And he has continued that work. It's changed his life. Let me tell you, this is impressive. This is what it looked like when you saw it?
The image is darker here, more contrasty than what the real shroud is.
He is somebody who has actually touched, felt, experimented with the Shroud of Turin. That's like somebody landing on the moon and coming back to tell you about it. He's an invaluable source of information.
Jackson has spent decades studying not just the image, but the contours of the cloth itself, contours that can severely distort the face Ray Downing is trying to decode.
This would be a two-dimensional distortion in the layout of the image that really should be there if this cloth really does what it looks like it did.
But for me, it's a bad thing, and I've got to weed it out, so I need to know exactly what it is.
Right, and so
because it's going to give me a face that doesn't look very human.
And we can work with you on getting
how much distortion is there.
That out. I think of it as a interesting and natural extension of the research that we've been working on. If anyone is interested in Jesus, if anyone loves Jesus, why wouldn't they want to see what he looked like three-dimensionally 2,000 years ago, if that's possible?
But as today's cutting-edge technology begins to coax a man's face from the ancient fabric, Downing must confront his first major challenge, the horrifying and bloody aftermath of the crucifixion itself. It's an incredibly difficult task. The linen itself is far from pristine. There are burn marks, bloodstains, and unexpected distortions, creating major problems for the graphics team. But to some, these imperfections are a kind of evidence.
Just because there are flaws in the image, that doesn't take anything away from it. If anything, it's like scars in a piece of leather. That's what makes it authentic. That's the evidence.
Believers in the shroud often go to great lengths to find proof of its authenticity. In late 2009, a Vatican researcher claimed to have deciphered faintly written words in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, scattered around the sacred cloth. Proof, she said, that the shroud was indeed 2,000 years old. But just 2 months earlier, an Italian chemist claimed to have completely reproduced the shroud using methods available to a medieval artist. It was the latest in a long line of attempts to discredit the shroud, stretching back to the mid-14th century.
Questions regarding the shroud's authenticity have dogged it since its earliest days.
The first uncontested appearance of the shroud was in 1355 in the French town of Lorraine. But even just a few years later, we had a French bishop, Pierre d'Arcis, who was claiming that the shroud was fake, that a painter had confessed to painting it.
It's pretty hard to believe that someone could just look at it in the 1300s and say, aha, it's a painted forgery, when we've subjected it to several 100,000 hours of analysis to today, and we can't come up with the idea that it's a painted forgery.
That document has not held up very well. At least not for Pierre d'Arcis.
Those early caveats were very quickly forgotten, and people went on with the business of accepting it as it was for quite a long while.
It would take nearly 6 centuries to disprove the bishop's assertion.
In 1978, a group of scientists were selected to study the shroud. Now, these were not selected by the church. These were selected in the United States. John Jackson of Colorado headed up the effort, and it was multidisciplinary. You had chemists and physicists and all kinds of specialties.
We were given 5 days, round-the-clock access to the shroud to study it with then high-technology equipment.
Well, I came into this being a total skeptic. And, you know, being a photographer, I pulled out my trusty 10X magnifier. I started looking at the image area. And there were no particulates. was no paint. There was no medium. There was nothing there except slightly darker, discolored surface fibers, just the tops of the fibrils. And at that point in time, I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't a painting.
Nor was it a drawing, a photograph, or a scorch mark. So what made the image? After 30 years of intensive analysis, the scientists who examined the shroud still have no idea.
They concluded that they really didn't know how the image was formed at all. And that was the really important discovery. And to some extent, this frustrated the scientists because they really wanted some answers and they didn't have them yet.
Of course, they're coming back and scratching their heads and saying, this is not easily solved.
It's not a fake, it's not a painting, it's not a photograph. So in essence, we can tell you what it's not, but we can't tell you what it is.
Though the shroud can only be reliably traced to medieval times, historians have a number of theories about its possible 2,000-year journey from Jerusalem to Turin. The trail begins in the kingdom of Edessa, in what is now Turkey, shortly after the death of Jesus in 33 AD.
The story is called The Legend of Abgar. Now, King Abgar was the reigning king of the city-state of Edessa in the 1st century, and he was dying of leprosy.
According to the legend, a Christian disciple came to Edessa with a linen cloth that bore an eerie image of the recently crucified Jesus.
King Abgar beholds this image, and within the course of 10 days, he is healed of leprosy.
But a few years later, a pagan king came to power. The miraculous Christian healing cloth was hidden away for safekeeping.
And it was literally forgotten about for at least 300 years. And then in 525, they rediscover that inside of a sealed metal box, this linen cloth with a mysterious image on it, no doubt with some documentation as to what it was. From that moment on, it is heralded as the true likeness of Christ, not made by human hands.
The shroud remained in Edessa for another 4 centuries, until the year 944, when it's believed to have been taken to Constantinople. 260 years later, the city was sacked by Crusaders and the shroud vanished.
It's very good evidence that the shroud was indeed in Constantinople in 1204, when French and Venetian knights captured the city of Constantinople. They took everything they could get their hands on.
At this point, the cloth disappeared from the historical record for 150 years.
The most likely thing is that the shroud was taken to Athens. There it was in the hands of the French Duke of Athens at the time. And he took it to his home in Besançon. We think that he did that probably about 1219 or a little earlier. And there he kept it at his home.
All of this remains only a theory. Nobody really knows what happened to the shroud for more than a century and a half.
We can be certain that the shroud that was brought to Lirey, France in 1356 is the same as the Shroud of Turin. The real question is the shroud the same cloth as what disappeared from Constantinople in 1204?
In 2009, a Vatican researcher unearthed a document suggesting that in the 13th century, a secretive group of French monks known as the Knights Templar worshipped a cloth with an image of Jesus on it.
And this shroud that appears in this document, it is proposed by the Vatican researchers, is the very shroud that left Constantinople and disappeared for the period of 150 years before it reappeared in France.
From 1450 all the way up to 1982, it was in the possession of the Savoy family. In 1983, the Duke of Savoy, he was the former exiled king of Italy, he died and then willed the shroud at that point to the Catholic Church.
Even if the shroud could be traced all the way back to ancient Jerusalem, this wouldn't prove that it's the same shroud that wrapped the body of Jesus. Instead, it's the image itself that tells the most compelling story.
Everything that we see on the shroud with regard to the injuries that the man sustained are perfectly consistent with what we see in the gospel account. You have a man who was both crucified and scourged. Remember from the biblical story, Pilate did not want to kill Jesus. Therefore, he had him scourged, hoping that that would placate those that were calling for his crucifixion. So now we have a man who is both severely scourged and crucified, which is a very unique anomaly.
The figure's agonizing wounds are marked in blood all over the shroud.
There's a lot of blood on the shroud. There's a tremendous amount of blood that flowed from the head, a scourging all over the body. There's a blood that flows from the side wound. There's also blood that puddles across the small of the back from that side wound.
These stains tell a horrifying story, but they also get in the way of the image. To raise the victim's face from the cloth, the graphics team will have to separate the man from his wounds.
It doesn't look like a light photograph.
The blood is very prominent also.
And you can also detect blood in here, blood in here. We should be able to pull those.
The blood stains in the image are two completely different subjects. The blood has been tested. It is clearly blood. In fact, it's not just blood. It is human blood.
The blood stains, we need to separate the 3D information from the blood. Now, I can see even in the mustache, probably in the beard, top of the beard, I'm seeing some of that same kind of red color come into there. Can you take that out?
Certainly the blood is part of the image itself, but of course you want to get around that. You can see the difference in color, and the blood images are in fact redder than the body image itself.
There's a slight bit of difference between the amount of red in the blood and the amount of red in the image. And what we did is we exaggerated that. We pumped more yellow into the image and more red into the blood, pulling them apart, just ripping the blood out of the shroud. And wound up with an astonishing image of the amount of blood on the shroud, exceeding my expectations entirely. And I was taken back by how much blood is actually present there. They beat this man to hell.
As the graphics team removes the distortions caused by the blood, their digital image moves one step closer to the resurrection. But the artists have barely begun to unravel the secret code. There's a blueprint hiding in this piece of linen, and what it reveals could shock the world.
It's actually in the wrist.
Working with renowned Shroud of Turin expert Dr. John Jackson, Ray Downing is trying to create a living, three-dimensional portrait of the man many believe to be Jesus Christ. After months spent examining the image on the shroud, Downing focuses on the cloth's most astonishing secret. Something Jackson first witnessed over 30 years ago.
I was a captain at the Air Force Weapons Laboratory in Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. I was on my first assignment. And I was also interested in the Shroud of Turin, certainly not as part of my official duties with the Air Force.
Out of curiosity, Jackson and his colleagues ran a photograph of the shroud's face through a VP8 image analyzer, a special computer that makes topographical maps of the moon and other heavenly bodies.
Now, this device basically establishes a sense of elevation by looking at light and darkness on the image.
What appeared on the screen was unlike any other photograph the machine had ever analyzed.
All of a sudden, I could see a three-dimensional relief representation of the intensity structures of the shroud.
This image zooms off the view screen in this amazing 3D contour. No painting has it, no artwork has it. It is totally unique to the shroud.
As soon as I saw what had happened, I knew immediately what the significance of this was.
The reason that this was so stunning was that it demonstrated that this cloth must have wrapped a three-dimensional human form. This doesn't occur because somebody painted it on a flat surface. This is the significance of the VP-8.
For Ray Downing, the significance is even greater. It means that the flat two-dimensional image on the shroud is intended to be viewed in 3 dimensions. If Downing is successful, for the first time in history, the man in the shroud will be seen the way its creator intended.
When you look at this shroud, you have the impression that it's a picture, but it's not a picture at all. It's a database of information. The 3D information in the shroud is explicit. It's deliberate. That's what makes it so peculiar. It's as if it was meant to be there.
But as Downing soon discovers, the code in the cloth isn't easily deciphered. The surface of the shroud is wildly uneven. This isn't a problem when the image is flat, but when he begins to convert it to 3D, the cloth itself gets in the way.
One of the problems you have in creating a 3D image from the cloth is the cloth is very dirty. It's got water stains on it. Also, there are imperfections in the weave of the cloth. And when you're looking at the cloth and you're trying to discern the image from which to build your 3D image, you get some very deep shadows that can distort the image that you're looking at.
It's going to be causing this kind of ripple effect throughout the whole image. It's going to be really difficult for us to clean up, take that out so we can actually see what we're working with.
Okay, let's get in here and take a look at that weave.
The team needs to be able to distinguish the face from the fabric it's imprinted on. Drawing on his decades of experience, Downing decides to use a technique known as fast Fourier transformation.
What it really means is some information is repetitive. And if it repeats, you can find it. So since the weave of the fabric is repetitive, the computer turns it into numbers, looks for repeating numbers, and pulls them out. That's how we got the weave out of the Shroud of Turin image.
That definitely a much clearer image.
There's a tremendous impact on a 3D analysis of that image once the noise is removed.
Now I can really take this and use this image now in order to create a good 3D model out of it, because it's much cleaner and I can see the edges of the head and I can see the edges of the hair. I can see a lot of the good features in there. That'll make it a lot easier to build a 3D model out of.
The 3D information encoded in the shroud will have a huge impact on the team's creation. When it was first revealed over 30 years ago, it changed the course of shroud research forever.
This was a seminal moment, and it really propelled the shroud into a tremendous amount of scientific inquiry. In fact, it launched the Shroud of Turin Research Project in 1978. When John Jackson, who was a physicist, approached other scientists and said, "Look at this," that's when people said, "Ooh, that's really interesting."
And so it was not hard to attract interest into the shroud. And I think it's more like a snowball that started to roll downhill, started to collect snow. Our snowball started to collect scientists.
The Catholic Church granted permission for Jackson's Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, to spend 5 days and nights studying the holy relic.
I
think it was very courageous in a way for the church to actually allow this to be done, because it had never been done before. Were there people in Turin who didn't want us to do this? Oh, yes. And they lobbied virtually until the last minute before the shroud was brought to us to try and stop us from doing this examination.
The scientists had 5 days, hands-on, continuous access, 122 hours because they worked through the night, and doing over 1,000 separate individual tests. Over 30,000 photographs were taken.
It was a pretty exhausting time.
But anyone hoping for a simple explanation of how the image had been made was disappointed.
The most significant result of the Shroud Project is this. You see, the Shroud of Turin either is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus, or it's not. And if it's not, then what is it? Well, if it's not authentic, then it must be the work of an artist. And yet the results of the Shroud Project are very clear. All the tests indicate that there is no visible trace of any kind of paint, ink, dye, pigmentation, stain, nothing. There's nothing on the cloth that was used by an artist to fabricate this image. It's just not there.
Seldom do science and religion intersect more intensely than with the Shroud of Turin. But in the earliest centuries of Christianity, there was a religious movement that claimed a scientific knowledge of how the universe came to be, a theory that some think may be related to the Shroud of Turin. These early Christians were known as Gnostics.
The Gnostics were spiritual explorers of the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, living in the Roman Empire, and they were very interested in trying to figure out how the universe devolved from perfect God to the mess we're in today.
The Gnostics focused on the origin and nature of the physical world, just as science does today. They believed that the entire universe had been cleaved in two, and that the visible world we were left with was an inferior illusion of what was meant to be.
Often when the Gnostics are talking about the perfect universe that is within God, they use the word pleroma, meaning fullness and volume. The perfect fullness that once existed seems to have been destroyed and downgraded by a division.
That means a three-dimensional entity, which then gets divided in two, that division is the creation of the visible world. A very, very interesting concept from a scientific point of view.
But this idea, and others like it, put the Gnostics at odds with mainstream Christianity. They were branded heretics.
And they were persecuted by the victorious Christians who had become the main religion of the Roman Empire. And by the 5th or 6th century, they were effectively extinct.
But could their ideas have survived? Could the notion of an invisible three-dimensional universe apply to the image on the Shroud of Turin?
If one were forced to single out one single thing about the Shroud of Turin, which separates it from every other artifact on the planet, it's the encoding of three-dimensional information within that two-dimensional surface. That singled the Shroud out as peculiar and unique. I see the Shroud of Turin as being an analogy for the physical world. It's three-dimensional information, but the image is really two-dimensional.
In the physical world, the dead don't come back to life. But if Downing succeeds, the image on the shroud will be resurrected once again. In 1988, the Catholic Church allowed a team of scientists to try and determine the linen's exact age. They used what was the most advanced technology available.
Carbon-14 dating, which has long been used in the dating of archaeological finds and much older remains of fossils and the like.
It was decided to test the shroud to see if it was indeed medieval, or, as some suspected, or was 1st century, as others suspected.
After 6 months, the results came back. They shocked the world.
Carbon-14 dating gave a result of a date range of 1260 to 1390, which, if the carbon date is correct, would indicate that the shroud is only 700 years old.
And that puts it right around the time it enters this historical record as far as we know. And it does seem to raise some serious questions about its history being any older than that.
And if that's the case, it can't possibly be the Shroud of Jesus.
Immediately, it was declared that the shroud was a fake. Newspapers carried it around the world. And anybody who doubts that should be a member of the Flat Earth Society.
But we shouldn't be devastated. There are so many reasons for us to put that testing into doubt. Not from a religious point of view, from a scientific point of view.
There are a number of theories that challenge the findings. Some suggest that the sample was cut from the corner of the sacred cloth and may not have been part of the original shroud at all.
There's clear evidence that the sample that was used to date the shroud in 1988 was cut from a corner of the cloth that was a medieval repair to the cloth.
Others point out that repeated handling of the shroud over the centuries could have contaminated the sample and skewed the results.
The location of the sample that was cut was from the outside corner edge, exactly where it has been held and handled hundreds of times in public exhibitions ever since 1418. There are numerous etchings and paintings of these exhibitions, and in every case, they are holding the shroud at that corner. And so, if you wanted to find the worst possible location to find a sample to cut the shroud, you would cut it from that corner, and that's exactly what happened. The public doesn't know that. All the public knows is the soundbite. The official position of the church is that it is an artifact worthy of veneration as an example of Christ's sufferings. They don't say that it's authentic. They don't say that it's a fake.
It's hard to imagine that a forger would have done this. The bigger question is, why would he? Why create something that is a negative, that has all this 3D attributes to it? Why create an image that was so complex unless somebody in the medieval had the foresight to say, oh, gosh, I got to fool somebody in the 21st century?
But fooling people in any century has never been that difficult. Our eyes fool us every single day. Though the early Gnostic Christians were called heretics for believing that much of the universe was invisible, scientists today know that the human eye can't really see the three-dimensional world we think it perceives.
Human beings don't see true three-dimensional representation of what we see around us. What we see is a representation of that space in a sort of two-dimensional plane, if you will. And our brains are very good at figuring all of this out for us instantaneously.
Each human eye is like a camera. It gets a two-dimensional image of a three-dimensional object. Now we have two eyes, however, and by combining the images of two eyes, we can extract three-dimensional information. So each eye is a two-dimensional camera. The combination of two eyes gives us three-dimensional information, which is why I can catch a baseball.
The human mind processes the two-dimensional images from each eye, constructing the third dimension that neither eye alone can see.
It's a mental process. It's a mental construct. You have information from it, but you haven't experienced it. That's shocking.
Downing believes the Shroud of Turin works in much the same way, a remarkably flat two-dimensional image with an invisible third dimension hidden within it.
The image on the shroud, and this is so uncanny, it contains the data for a three-dimensional image. And it fools our own perceptions because we're so used to seeing what we think is 3D. It just looks like that. Our brains are ahead of us on this one. We think we see something that we really don't see.
By decoding the secret language hidden in the shroud, the 3D animators hope to flesh out the face on the cloth.
Once you realize that the Shroud of Turin contains three-dimensional information, the idea of making a 3D face, this is almost inevitable. It follows directly from it.
But there's a catch. The 3D information leads to a face that doesn't quite look real.
If it isn't human, it certainly isn't Jesus. I think the solution to it is to realize that the shroud wasn't hanging on a wall, that it was wrapping a corpse. That's the crux of the problem. The face is hidden in there.
Hidden not by the cloth itself, but by the way it was draped over the body beneath it. It's a problem that has plagued John Jackson for 30 years.
On the top part of the body, the cloth meanders over the body in some fashion. Therefore, when you take the cloth and stretch it flat, you're going to have two-dimensional stretching distortion, and you really need to correct for that. This is an experiment to intentionally put 3D information into an image.
Jackson and his colleagues have devised an experiment to show how the draping of the cloth affects the 3D image on the shroud, using a shop-bought sculpture of Jesus.
This face is coated with a fluorescent surface that will reflect when we charge it with a UV light. So what we'll do is we'll put this down into this colored fluid, which will attenuate the light in proportion to the distance.
Photographing the sculpture from the top of the tank should generate an undistorted image, as if it were made on a perfectly flat shroud.
You've got it. Three-dimensional.
When this picture is processed with 3D imaging software, the result looks like a normal human face.
The next step, what we want to do is to do the exact same experiment, except this time we're not going to have a flat reference surface. Do you see how the plastic is curved like a cloth draping over the face? So now, what we're going to do will be then to charge the face, put it in the water, and we'll take a picture.
Right, we have the image loaded.
The result this time? The face is distorted and flat, sunken in the middle, and without a nose.
This looks pretty much like what we've been getting on the computer.
It sort of has that flatness to it.
Yeah,
It doesn't
exactly.
have
That's full dimensionality. We've got 3D information, but it's not the whole data set. And that robs some of the information away from it, and that's what we have to put back there to get a reasonable face, like the one you saw the first time.
Jackson has proved that the contours of the cloth are the source of Downing's problems, but the graphics team will still have to work out exactly what those contours are.
We're kind of stuck.
Otherwise, they might never be able to distinguish the true face of the man in the shroud.
And that's what we're banging our head against.
Computer graphics artist Ray Downing and his team are trying to resurrect the man in the Shroud of Turin. They hope to create the most realistic three-dimensional portrait ever made of what many believe to be the face of Jesus Christ. It's a high-tech process, but to determine how the fabric of the shroud would have covered the face inside it, Downing reverts to a low-tech solution.
What I did yesterday, I took a tracing of that, and I placed it how it was when it first formed.
The first thing we did when we started trying to analyze what was going on with the shroud was to trace it onto a piece of cloth and then lay that tracing on top of a head and see what happened.
Lines here, it's actually really helping to show what's going on with the actual wrapping, and we can bring that into 3D and really show how we can build it.
Exactly. By imitating those distortions, we could take the shroud image and put it back into that shape and figure out what the face looked like. It gave us a blueprint.
You can see the figure looks more human.
Yeah, looking really good.
Do you think you'll be able to use this profile?
Yeah, it's going to be very helpful for me because what I can do is I can actually take this information and start building a real three-dimensional head just through information that you pulled right from the shroud. And then we can put a back head on there, and then we can go from there to make a really good 3D face.
The shroud is a negative, but the clue is that you have to talk in terms of a three-dimensional negative. And there is such a thing. It's called a mold. A 3D negative is a mold. It's a container. You fill it, you have a three-dimensional thing formed from it. And that's what the Shroud of Turin is an instruction set for. It encodes a three-dimensional mold.
But given the devastating results of the carbon-14 tests, which showed the shroud was only 700 years old, can the image on the cloth really claim to be the face of Jesus? Though some scientific researchers have pronounced the shroud a fake because of the controversial carbon-14 tests, the mystery lingers on. Historical researchers have found evidence in some dark corners of the past that suggests that the shroud existed long before its first known appearance in 14th century France.
The biggest problem with shroud history is that there are huge gaps in it. If we have a verifiable history of the shroud, it really only goes back to about 1350. But we have all these other clues earlier in the historic record.
Many historians believe the shroud was in Constantinople until the city was destroyed in the year 1204. But no one could account for its whereabouts after that, until it turned up in France 150 years later. That is, until now.
We have now additional testimony from France that suggests that the cloth was well known.
New evidence suggests that a secretive band of holy crusaders known as the Knights Templar may have had possession of the shroud, or at the very least were aware of its existence, in the year 1287.
Over the years, the real serious shroud historians have always associated the shroud to, at some point in its history, to the Knights Templar.
Just in this last year, a Vatican researcher unearthed a document, the memoir of a man who was a member of the Knights Templar. And in this document, he said that as part of his training as one of the Knights Templar, he was made to kiss a long linen cloth on which was imprinted the image of a man. And this shroud that appears in this document, it is proposed by the Vatican researchers, is the very shroud that left Constantinople and disappeared for the period of 150 years before it reappeared in France.
It doesn't mean necessarily they had possession of it. It does mean that they probably knew about it.
Other historical evidence seems to date the shroud even earlier in time, at least to the late 12th century.
Probably one of the most significant documents to be unearthed in the past 30 years or so with regard to the history of the shroud is the Hungarian Prey manuscript.
Two of the illustrations are very significant. One of them shows the burial preparations. You see Jesus lying on a burial shroud. You actually see Jesus lying on this cloth. Now, what's interesting about it is that the way the body is laid out is very similar to what we see on the shroud. But what is more fascinating is the second picture, which is the empty tomb. Or to be more precise, the empty shroud.
Very clearly, it is showing the zigzag lines of the herringbone pattern weave of the shroud. The shroud has a very distinctive weave.
Most importantly, it illustrated a set of L-shaped burn holes that are on the shroud and predate the fire of 1532 that did all the damage down both sides of the shroud. So if you looked at the shroud prior to 1352, what you would see first, before you saw anything else, were these L-shaped burn holes which had dark char around each hole.
To me, I call this a DNA match. There's no question that what is depicted on the Hungarian Prey manuscript is exactly what we know today as the Shroud of Turin.
So we know that whoever illuminated the Hungarian Prey manuscript had seen what we call the Shroud of Turin at some point before he created that manuscript in 1191.
And that is much earlier than the first possible date assigned by this carbon-14 dating.
Dig deeper in time, and historians pick up the trail of a small blood-stained cloth called the Sudarium of Oviedo, known to exist as far back as the 7th century.
In the gospel accounts of the Passion of Jesus, there were two cloths. One was the burial shroud, which is the one that we know as the shroud, the large cloth. But the other was the smaller face cloth, as it was called.
Sudarium of Oviedo is believed to be the cloth that wrapped Jesus' face when he was on the cross. As soon as he passed away, it would have been a tradition to cover the face of the deceased.
Even in modern days, if there's an accident and somebody dies and the victim's laying there, what do? We cover his face.
It's about the size of a small bath towel. It is in Oviedo, Spain, and has been there ever since the early 7th century, about 616. Now, this Sudarium of Oviedo is nothing like the shroud. If you were to look at it, it looked like there's just a mess.
The Sudarium seems to be a much bloodier cloth, and indeed it is. If it was used first, it would have absorbed much of the blood.
But put them together, and the blood on the Sudarium corresponds with the face on the shroud.
Which suggests that both cloths covered the same face at approximately the same time.
And we know the Sudarium has a documented history to the early 7th century. If these two cloths are correlated, then obviously the shroud must have a date far earlier than the medieval date as suggested by the carbon dating labs.
Something else the two cloths appear to have in common are traces of pollen that have been found in their fibers, traces that may offer a clue about where the cloths originally came from.
There is much unique pollen that is unique to Israel. In fact, there is one plant called Gundelia tourneforti, and this particular plant is a flowering thorn plant, and it grows within a 50-mile radius of Jerusalem. From a point of science, the Shroud of Turin can never be proven absolutely to be the Shroud of Jesus. It can't. But there's a different view of evidence, and that is the courtroom definition of evidence. If, for instance, the shroud was on trial as to whether it's authentic or not, I believe the jury would say it's authentic.
Now, one man is taking the search for answers a step further, attempting to bring the witness himself to the stand. Using state-of-the-art imaging technology, Ray Downing's computer graphics team is working to create a living, three-dimensional portrait of the man in the Shroud of Turin, an image many believe to be of Jesus Christ. To do this, Downing's team needs to examine the image on a microscopic level.
The image of the man is so superficial that it penetrates only the top 2 microfibers of the image. And I'm talking about threads, I'm talking about microfibers.
If you pull one fiber aside, there is no image below it. So there's no possible way that this was created with liquid.
It's so superficial that if you were to take a razor blade and shave the surface of the cloth, the image would disappear. That's how superficial it is.
How do you do that? I mean, you can't paint with a one camel hair brush, especially because you can't see it until you're about 10 feet away. There's no way.
Even more puzzling is the illusion of shading where there is none.
There's no gradation of color. That's your eyes mixing things. What you really have in the Shroud of Turin is one kind of information, one color, which is repeated The more it's repeated, the darker it is. The less it's repeated, the lighter it is. It looks like a smooth, continuous gradation at a distance. Move up close, and it's made out of dots.
All these dots combine to make an image, like the pixels on a computer screen. But one overarching mystery remains. How did the image get there?
I call the shroud the X-Files of Christianity. Is it possible that this 14-foot-long linen cloth captured the greatest paranormal event of all time?
Not only do I not know how that image came to be, but scientists don't know. And for me, personally, it's a great invitation to say, maybe there's a miracle here. Maybe it truly was the power of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth that brought that image to be.
There's two schools of thought on a miraculous image. One is that the image is purely miraculous. The other school of thought is that the image was somehow created by a byproduct of a miracle, and that miracle being the resurrection. And not to sound sacrilegious, but the snap, crackle, and pop of the resurrection or something, some sort of energy.
After decades of careful study, John Jackson believes that the image was generated by radiation, or in other words, light.
I keep gravitating towards a radiant mechanism that put the image on the cloth. And therefore, we have to start logically thinking that the body somehow is the source of this radiation.
How could a body be the source of such intense light? Science has been unable to tell us. But for many believers in Christianity, the answer seems obvious: the resurrection.
So when you look at the science of the shroud, we're scratching our heads and trying to say, what is it? What caused this discoloration? I think personal belief based on Scripture and based on science is that the very split second that Jesus' soul zoomed back into that lifeless body, there was an explosion of light and gone.
To explore this religious belief scientifically requires an understanding of how light works. Whatever the source of the light may have been, light only travels in two ways: in a straight line like a laser, or spread out and diffuse like a light bulb. But neither method could have created the image on the shroud. If the light traveled straight like a laser, the image should have been a harsh silhouette. If it spread out like a light bulb, it should have been an indistinct blur.
It should have been a very, very, very fuzzy shadow. That is not what you have.
Instead, the image is delicately nuanced and detailed, as if much of the light from the body simply never made it onto the cloth. It's a mystery that has fascinated Ray Downing throughout his studies of the shroud.
When you talk about the Shroud of Turin, and you talk about what happened to that information that didn't get there, where did it go? Did it go someplace else? You have a body disappearing, and you have particles that don't hit its target. There's a possibility that they went to the same place.
But where is that place? Could they have gone to a place that humans cannot see, to another dimension? Does such a thing exist? Some believe the answer is yes. Scientists today are exploring the possibility that the universe has hidden dimensions in much the same way as a hologram.
A hologram itself records all the visual information in a three-dimensional volume on a two-dimensional surface. So we really are encoding the full three-dimensional volume information on a two-dimensional surface. It's a remarkable thing. And one of the more exciting aspects of modern physics is the question, and it's really being discussed, of whether the universe of our experience all of the space and time may be, in some sense, a hologram. And that's a fascinating concept.
It's a concept that some early Christians known as Gnostics were exploring almost 2,000 years ago.
People hear about the holographic universe, that the three-dimensional information of the universe can be represented in a two-dimensional surface way. It's exactly what the Gnostics were on about.
One of their texts, the Gospel of Thomas, alludes to this point.
The most prominent of the Thomas Gospel ideas is that the kingdom of heaven is spread out on the earth already and people don't see it. Gospel of Thomas is saying the kingdom of heaven has been here since the beginning of the world, since the first week of creation, and it's become obscured and people don't see it. And the goal of the Christian movement, Jesus says in Thomas, is to find this hidden kingdom.
Perhaps they need look no further than the Shroud of Turin, a two-dimensional object with a third dimension of information hidden within. Could the face on the shroud be a metaphor for the universe itself? For the computer graphics team, the search for the shroud's hidden face has been purely scientific. But science can only lead them so far. To complete the face in the shroud requires the skill of an artist.
Inevitably, you do get to a point where you run out of information. You cannot see the pores in a linen fabric. There's no eyebrows in the shroud. The hair is the same, and beard is the same color as the face. Why? The shroud doesn't have color.
All we got to do is put some of the missing features that we have. We got a good silhouette for hair, and we got good information for some of the facial features like the nose and the eyebrows, and the mouth looks really good. You can even see a really good beard and mustache coming out really well. So you can use a hair system to build that, use it to match what we have here in the image, and then just put a dark brown kind of color on it, and it'll match really well.
But it doesn't take a lot of guesswork to assign pores and skin textures to a model, to know that the man did have eyebrows, and to provide them. So at some point, you do have to leave the realm of actual information and use experience. The eyes are actually one of the easiest things to do because they're spheres. You just have to construct all the things that gives eyes their quality, their depth, their sparkle, their color. The eyes blink, and you go, whoa, this is real. And I've got a lot of information about that face. And my estimation is I think we're pretty darn close to what this man looked like.
But is this the man who was crucified in the year 33 AD? Could this cloth contain the final piece of evidence linking it to the burial of Jesus? A piece of evidence that may have been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Ray Downing's 3D imaging team has nearly finished creating their historical 3D model of the man in the Shroud of Turin. But did this mysterious cloth really wrap the crucified body of Jesus Christ? Dr. John Jackson believes that he may have found the hidden clue that proves it.
We can see on the shroud image that there's a disruption at the base of the chin that could be accounted for by something external to disrupt the image.
That something may have been the mysterious 3-inch wide strip of cloth that runs the length of the shroud.
There's been a lot of discussion, controversy about what this might be.
High-resolution backlit photographs of the fabric show that the complex weave of the strip is identical to that of the main cloth.
The strip on the side was an integral part of the shroud at one time. It evidently was removed and then sewn back.
But why would someone have removed a strip from the edge of the shroud? Jackson believes that it was used to secure the body inside the shroud in accordance with Jewish burial customs.
On the shroud, we have the legs. Looks like they're being held together. And likewise, the arms, in a natural position, would be off like this, but they're not. It's like the arms are being held together directly. It's as if there's something on the outside of this cloth holding this shrouded package, if you will, together. I would submit that a candidate for this is the side strip that runs along the length of the shroud was cut off and then used in sort of a makeshift manner to hold the body together. Then it was later, for whatever reason, reattached back onto the shroud, so we have it today. That's a hypothesis that is, I think, consistent with what we know about the shroud.
He also believes it helps to explain one of the most important passages in the New Testament.
We know from the Gospels that Christ was crucified and died and then was taken off the cross. And according to the tradition of the Jews, his body would have been wrapped in linen and brought to a tomb. And according to the Gospels, it was the morning of the third day in which Jesus rose again.
What happened in the tomb early Sunday morning? Mary goes to the tomb and sees the stone has been rolled aside from the entrance. Sees that the body is gone. Runs to find Simon Peter and John. And she says to them, "Someone has taken the Lord's body, and I don't know where they've put him." And I'll just stop right there. Mary's first impression is that someone stole the body. So John and Peter run to the tomb.
And John arrives first. And as he's walking into that tomb, expecting to see the crucified Christ, his master, his teacher, he finds that there's a linen, a shroud.
And John says, "And I saw and believed that he had risen." So very interesting. Mary thinks the body's stolen. John and Peter go in and see the cloth lying there and believe that he had risen. So the question is, what did they see that Mary didn't see? And I believe that it has to do with the linen shroud. The shroud is the first piece of evidence that indicated that something extraordinary had happened here, and certainly not that the body was stolen. Now, if you saw the cloth wrapped up and balled up and thrown into a corner somewhere, well then sure, okay, maybe the body was stolen. But the way that the shroud was laid out, flat on this stone sepulcher, just the same way that it was on Friday when Jesus was placed in it, strips of linen bound around the outside of the cloth, it was obvious that something extraordinary had happened here, something beyond human reason.
That moment in which the tomb was seen empty for the first time could be described as evidence that Jesus truly was who he said he was. That's the belief that all of us Christians profess. It's the good news of the gospel.
Transformed into light and gone.
"2,000 years later, a graphics team in upstate New York is preparing a very different kind of resurrection.
The face of Jesus was like a nebulous thing. How would we know if we got there, you know? How would we know we had done it? I do a lot of 3D work, and I think this is the most difficult project I've ever worked on.
There's human nature that we always want to put a name with a face. The scripture gives us the name. The shroud gives us the face.
Although the team's focus has been on the face, the shroud also contains information about the size and shape of the figure's body.
The shroud does show both the frontal and dorsal image of a naked man crucified and dead. And the information is there, and we did reference that information. body in the Shroud of Turin, as we've shown it, is very close to what we believe the position and the shape and the body type of Jesus was. In addition to that, it tells a story apart from the face, and that's of the Passion.
Having isolated all the blood from the image on the shroud, Downing is able to apply it to the model of the body, creating the first forensically accurate image of the man many believe to have been Jesus Christ. The result is astounding.
It looks like an automobile accident. That's the best way I can describe it. It's devastating, vicious. That's all you can say about it, vicious.
With 6 months of intense work behind him, there's one final task left to complete.
The eyelashes were, in fact, the last thing I worked on. There was a slight misalignment of the eyelashes, and I just wanted to make they sat on the eyes in the correct way. I mean, at the end of it, it has to look good. Then you have to let go. I had to decide, now, how am I going to show this? What is it going to do? How am I going to present this? And it occurred to me, I wanted to go to the essence of the story. But there were two stories. There's a story of the Shroud and there's a story of Jesus. Two separate stories, both intertwined. And the story of the Shroud is the story of a transition from two-dimensional to three-dimensional, from a picture to a statue. And the story of Jesus is a story from death to life, and they're the same story.
After 6 months of intense work, it's time to reveal the face of the man in the shroud. It may be the most accurate image of Jesus Christ ever made. And yet it's a far cry from the picture Ray Downing started with.
If you put our face of Jesus next to the Shroud of Turin and say, does this man look like this man? And the answer is no. Because what you're seeing in the Shroud of Turin is not a picture of a face. It's a database of information. And the sculpture was made from that database. So does the Shroud of Turin and my depiction of Jesus look the same? Yeah. In a three-dimensional way? Yeah. In a two-dimensional way? Shouldn't and doesn't. The picture of the man in the shroud is seen as taken to be much older than a 30-year-old man. And one of the reasons for that is hair and mustache and beard are white. So you get the impression of this older man with white hair. And he just is not. The most prominent feature in the face of Jesus is obviously his nose. I didn't do him any tremendous favors. I kind of did what I found. Every time I draped a shroud-like cloth over a face, it did what I call tenting, because the nose is the high point and it forms a pyramid. But what I found was a nose that was somewhat shorter than the nose on the shroud, because the wrapping of the cloth around the edges actually elongates the nose. What you see in the shroud is a cavernous eyes with very little detail, and then what looks like marbles. Eyebrows don't appear at all. So the eyebrows, probably more than anything else, give this particular model its distinctive look.
Thanks to computer technology, the team is able to bring their creation off the screen and into the physical world.
Now, there's a way of outputting your 3D model to a real physical model, and it's called fast prototyping. And that's exactly what we did with the Shroud of Turin. This is the face of Jesus that we made, output, using lasers to a model. And now we can hold in our hand the death mask.
Is this, in fact, the death mask of the man in the shroud? Downing knows there's only one way to prove it. He needs to do the impossible.
Is this the face that caused the Shroud of Turin? Ideally, you would want to be able to derive the Shroud of Turin from this face. Well, the problem came up that nobody knows how to make the Shroud of Turin. That's the mystery of the Shroud of Turin.
The mystery is that the light emitted from the body could only have traveled in two ways. Radially, meaning it spread out like a light bulb, or directionally, meaning it traveled in a straight line like a laser. Neither method would produce an image like that on the Shroud of Turin.
If you want to create the Shroud of Turin, you can't use radial light. It's too out of focus. Directional light, nice and focused light, no information. You don't see a face. But there's an in-between. The way you do it is you use slices in order to do it.
Slices, narrowly focused slivers of light moving slowly across the image. But what kind of technology can produce this unique form of light? In fact, it's nothing more complex than a simple desktop scanner.
A desktop scanner has a unique property to it. And what that is, you see the light being transported across the document. And what we found was that by making slices of light and time, we could encode this face. And then check it and see if it matches. We took that file and overlaid it for comparison with the Shroud of Turin. And I was astounded. They exactly match.
But does this image contain the kind of 3D encoding hidden in the Shroud of Turin? Could Downing have achieved what has long been thought impossible and deciphered the Shroud's mysterious code?
So we did exactly what we did with the Shroud of Turin. We took that image into our 3D software and extruded it from a flat plane. We got a full 180-degree sculpture of the face in profile. For me, that closed the circle. The device we're using is 20th century technology, but the principle goes back forever. It's not a trick of technologies. The Shroud of Turin is an instruction set for building that face, and that's what we have done.
Why is the Shroud significant? From a point of science, the Shroud of Turin can never be proven absolutely to be the Shroud of Jesus. It can't. I often wonder, okay, if the Shroud is authentic, then it must have a purpose, it must have a plan. There must be a reason for it to be here.
We may have a sort of silent witness here that, in effect, was a witness to those events. And if we can be clever enough to study those, to unpack what's there, then we may have a real opportunity where science and religion can come together most profoundly at that point.
As far as the shroud being an interesting historical object, something that it's worth studying and worth thinking about, it doesn't matter at all if it's real. What matters is the stories that faithful through the generations have brought to it, and what we can learn about them through studying something like the shroud.
Is it possible that the shroud presents an opportunity for 21st century people across the world to literally see the resurrected Christ through photography, to see it for themselves, and in a sense, in a proverbial way, to place our hands into his nail wounds and be not faithless but believe?
Look, everybody can see that there's an image there. What does it mean? Well, the answer is not on the cloth. That becomes something that's truly in the eye and the heart of the beholder. So each person is really going to have to make that choice for himself.
When I look at the shroud, my faith increases. I can't say for sure that this is definitely authentic, but what I can say is that it corresponds to the Jesus I know from the Gospels. Is my faith dependent on the shroud? No. Do I believe that it is authentic? You better believe it.